Patricia Voss held the check up to the light like she was checking for a forgery, and then, in front of a lobby full of strangers, she tore it clean in half. "Women like you don't walk in here with $10 million, she said, loud enough that 3 tellers stopped typing and a security guard turned his head. She looked Angela Reeves up and down, the worn trainers, the faded denim jacket, the 9-year-old boy gripping her hand, and she smiled like she'd just solved a puzzle nobody else in the room could see. Then she picked up the phone and called the police to report a fraud. Angela didn't raise her voice. She knelt down, put her hand on her son's shoulder, and told him quietly that everything was going to be fine. Then she looked back at Patricia and said the sentence that would end up quoted in every newspaper in the country by the following week. "You just made the most expensive mistake of your career." Before security could reach for her arm, before the 2 officers even had time to pull up outside, the glass doors at the front of the branch swung open, and a man in a charcoal overcoat walked in carrying nothing but a phone and the unhurried confidence of somebody who owned the building. He looked at the torn paper scattered across the tile. He looked at the boy's tear-streaked face. And then he looked at Angela and said 2 words that changed the temperature of the entire room. "Good afternoon, ma'am." If a story like this hits home for you, stay with it, because what happens in the next 10 minutes of this branch's history says more about how this country treats people than any headline ever could. Now let's go back to where it actually started, 3 hours before that check ever hit the counter. Angela Reeves was 36 years old, and for the last 6 years she had raised her son Daniel alone in a narrow terraced house on the edge of Chorlton, a quiet corner of Manchester where nobody looked twice at her second-hand Corsa or the same grey jacket she'd owned since before Daniel could walk. Daniel's father had left before his first birthday, chasing a version of his own life that didn't include either of them, and Angela had simply kept moving forward because stopping had never once felt like an option worth considering. She woke at 5 every morning. She made Daniel's packed lunch, walked him to school, and picked him up every single afternoon unless a client meeting ran unforgivably long, and even then, she arranged for her sister to collect him rather than miss the bedtime routine they'd built together out of nothing but consistency and stubbornness. Nobody at Daniel's school knew that the woman who showed up in scuffed trainers had built Reeves Logistics Solutions from a single rented van into a company that now moved freight for half the independent retailers in the Northwest. Angela preferred it that way. She didn't want her son growing up believing that money made a person worth listening to, or that a person's value could be read off the label stitched into their coat. She still drove the same car she'd bought used 8 years earlier. She still wore the same watch, a cheap digital thing that had survived 2 cracked screens. Her success sat quietly in the background of an ordinary life, visible only to the people who genuinely needed to know it existed, her accountant, her solicitor, and the small circle of investors who'd backed her early enough to remember what the company looked like before it mattered to anyone else. She remembered the early years clearly, the way people only remember the things that nearly broke them. There had been a winter, for years back, when she'd slept in the passenger seat of a rented van outside a warehouse in Trafford Park because the heating at home had gone and every spare pound was already promised to a supplier who wouldn't wait. She remembered ringing 3 different nurseries in the same week, being quoted fees that cost more than she made in a month, and understanding for the first time exactly why so many parents she knew had quietly given up on the idea of climbing any higher than where they already stood. She had built Reeves Logistics 1 delivery route at a time, negotiating contracts from a laptop balanced on her knee in that same van, teaching herself the freight business from forums and second-hand textbooks because nobody in her family had ever worked in an office, let alone owned one. None of that history showed on her face when she walked into a room. She had learned, slowly and at some cost, that the version of herself people responded to best was the smallest, quietest one, the one who didn't take up space, didn't raise her voice, didn't wear anything that might invite a question she didn't feel like answering that day. It wasn't shame. It was armor. And most days, in most rooms, it worked exactly as intended. That Tuesday morning, a check for $10 million had cleared into her business account, the final payout from an early stake she'd sold in a warehouse automation startup that had gone from a footnote to a headline almost overnight. Angela already knew exactly where the money was going. Half would go into a trust for Daniel, untouched until he was old enough to understand what it actually meant. The other half was seed money for something she'd been planning quietly for 3 years, a fund to help single parents in Greater Manchester access affordable childcare so they could actually take the jobs they were qualified for, instead of turning them down because nursery fees cost more than the wage itself. She brought Daniel along because they had plans for the rest of the afternoon, plans he had been talking about since breakfast. First the bank, then the bookshop on Dean's Gate, then chips at the cafe he loved on the corner near the tram stop. It was supposed to be the easiest stop of the day, a formality, 10 minutes at most, before the two of them went back to simply being mother and son instead of founder and dependent. She had even promised him he could pick out 4 books instead of the usual 2, because she was in the kind of mood that made her generous with small things. Neither of them expected the visit to take longer than it took to sign a deposit slip.
They walked into the Fallowfield branch of Crown and Albion Bank not long before closing time. Angela had banked there for 11 years, since before Daniel was born, since before Reeves Logistics had a name anyone recognized outside a small circle of freight brokers. But the woman behind the manager's desk that afternoon, Patricia Voss, had only transferred to that branch 6 weeks earlier. She didn't know Angela's history. She had never pulled up the account. She had no idea that the woman in the gray jacket had been a fixture on that branch's ledgers for over a decade, long before Patricia Voss ever set foot inside the building. Patricia's eyes moved over Angela the second she walked through the door, then down to Daniel, then out to the tired little Corsa parked crookedly out front. Other customers who came through in pressed blazers were greeted before they'd even crossed the threshold. Angela and Daniel stood at the counter for nearly 6 minutes while 2 tellers stayed idle, glancing at each other rather than calling anyone forward. Daniel tugged at his mother's sleeve and asked quietly why nobody was helping them yet. Angela told him to be patient, that it never paid to assume the worst about people before they'd actually done anything to earn it. When Angela finally reached the counter, she placed the check down and asked for it to be paid into the account she'd held for 11 years. The number on the check caught the teller's attention immediately, and within seconds Patricia was standing behind the counter herself, though not to help. Instead of pulling up the account history, something any manager could have done in under a minute, she began questioning Angela about where the money had come from, her voice pitched loud enough to carry across half the lobby. Angela answered every question without losing her composure. She handed over her passport, her business card, her account number, and the share sale paperwork confirming exactly where the money had come from. She offered to let Patricia ring the issuing solicitor directly, right there at the counter, so the whole thing could be verified in minutes. By any reasonable standard, it was more than enough for a transaction that should have taken no time at all. Patricia flicked through the paperwork the way a bored customs officer flicks through a passport they've already decided not to believe. She asked Angela to repeat the name of her company, then asked it again a moment later as though she hadn't quite trusted the answer the first time. She asked how long Angela had been in this line of work, and when Angela said 11 years, Patricia let out a short breath through her nose, the kind of sound that isn't quite a laugh, but wants to be heard as one. A queue had begun to form behind them, an elderly man clutching a pension book, a young couple whispering to each other, a delivery driver checking his watch, and every one of them could hear exactly what was being said at the counter, because Patricia had never once lowered her voice. Patricia looked at the documents without really looking at them. She told Angela that a woman carrying $10 million wouldn't be driving a car like that or wearing trainers with the sole peeling at the toe. A young cashier named Priya Anand offered to make the verification call herself, but Patricia cut her off before she could reach for the receiver, ordering her back to her own till in a tone that left no room for discussion. By then, several customers had noticed the tension building at the counter, and more than one had already pulled out a phone to record. A man near the door said, loud enough for Daniel to hear, that she was probably using her own kid to make the scam look more convincing. Nobody in the lobby spoke up against it. They simply kept their phones raised, waiting to see what would happen next, the way people always seem to when the thing unfolding in front of them costs nothing to watch and everything to interrupt. Daniel's hand found his mother's and gripped it tightly, his earlier confidence draining out of him all at once. Angela kept her voice even and asked Patricia one more time to make the call before this went any further. Her calm only seemed to provoke the woman further. In front of the tellers, the security guard, and every customer still filming, Patricia announced that the check was fraudulent, though she hadn't verified a single detail of it. Angela reminded her, still evenly, that she was handling a customer's legitimate assets and should think carefully about what she did next. Patricia heard that as a threat instead of a warning. She snatched the check off the counter, looked Angela dead in the eye, and told her that women like her didn't walk in here with $10 million. Then she tore it in half, then into smaller pieces, and let them fall to the floor at Angela's feet, in full view of her son. The lobby went silent. Daniel bent down as if to gather the torn pieces, but Angela stopped him gently, unwilling to let her son kneel on the floor to collect what someone had just used to humiliate her. She looked at Patricia and told her, without raising her voice, that she had just made the most expensive mistake of her career. Patricia called the police, telling the dispatcher that a woman was using fraudulent documents, threatening staff, and refusing to leave the premises. Then she ordered the branch's security guard, a heavy-set man named Marcus Webb, to escort Angela out of the building. Marcus hesitated for a moment, uncertain why he was being asked to remove a woman who had done nothing but stand quietly at a counter, but a direct order from his manager, in front of a lobby full of witnesses, left him little room to argue. Daniel looked up at his mother as the guard approached, his eyes wide with a fear no 9-year-old should have to carry into a bank on an ordinary Tuesday. Angela tightened her hand around his, keeping her voice low so only he could hear her telling him that everything would be fine, so long as he stayed close. She thought, in that strange suspended second before Marcus's hand actually landed on her arm, about every single thing she had done right in the last 6 years to keep this exact moment from ever reaching her son. The birthday parties she'd hosted in the small back garden because she couldn't afford the soft play center the other mums used. The extra shifts she'd quietly worked so he never noticed the months were tight. The bedtime stories she read in 3 different silly voices, so he'd fall asleep laughing instead of asking questions about his father. She had built an entire childhood around the idea that the world was fundamentally fair if you simply worked hard enough inside it, and she understood, watching Daniel's face crumple in a bank lobby on a Tuesday afternoon, that the lesson was about to be undone in front of her in less time than it had taken to build. She understood the position she was in. She could resist and risk turning a bad situation into something dangerous with her son standing beside her, or she could stay calm and wait for the truth to catch up to the moment. She chose not to fight the order, but she also refused to walk out the door before someone confirmed what she already knew to be true. She glanced down at the torn pieces of paper scattered across the tile, the remnants of a childcare fund that hadn't even had the chance to exist yet, and felt something harden in her chest that had nothing to do with anger. It was closer to certainty. Somewhere in the last 10 minutes, this had stopped being about $10 million. It had started being about every assumption a room full of strangers had made about her before she'd ever said a word. Marcus's grip stayed light on Angela's arm as they moved toward the glass doors, but Daniel couldn't stop looking back at the torn pieces of the check still scattered across the floor. He wrapped both arms around his mother's waist, pressed his face into her side, and asked the guard in a small voice not to take her away. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he kept walking, caught between a manager's order and the plain evidence of his own eyes. Patricia called out from behind the counter, telling one of the tellers to hold the boy back so he couldn't, in her words, obstruct an officer of the bank from doing his job. It was the first time Angela's calm cracked. She had absorbed the accusations, the insults about her car and her trainers, even the humiliation of watching her own money torn apart in front of strangers. But the moment someone suggested touching her son, her voice changed entirely. "No one touches him," she said, quiet and absolute. Patricia seized on that reaction immediately, telling the gathering crowd that her sudden intensity was proof of exactly the aggression she'd been warning them about since Angela walked through the door. Angela understood, in that instant, that every word out of her mouth and every motion of her body was being read through a lens that had already decided who she was before she'd said a word. She lowered her voice, kept her hands visible, and pulled Daniel in close against her hip, away from the guard who had come to take her out. It struck her, standing there, how quickly a mother's instinct to protect her child could be twisted into evidence against her. Priya spoke up again, the second time she'd tried to intervene since the confrontation began. She reminded Patricia, as steadily as she could manage, that Angela hadn't threatened anyone, and that a single phone call to the issuing solicitor would settle the entire matter in minutes. Patricia turned on her instead, threatening to sack her on the spot if she said another word in front of customers who were still filming every second of it. Priya didn't back down entirely, but she stopped talking, aware that losing her job would help no one in that lobby, least of all the woman standing beside her frightened son. She'd only been at the branch a little over a year, and she'd watched Patricia dismiss more than one customer in ways that never quite sat right with her. Standing there watching Daniel's face crumple, she understood that whatever she'd told herself before no longer held up. The customers kept recording. Nobody lowered a phone to speak. Nobody stepped between Patricia and the family she was dismantling in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. They wanted the spectacle, but none of them wanted to be the first person to risk anything by standing on the side of a stranger they'd never met before that day. There was an older woman near the entrance who Angela would later remember more clearly than almost anyone else in that lobby, not because she'd said anything, but because of how long she'd stood there watching, phone lowered at her side the entire time, doing absolutely nothing with the fact that she wasn't recording. She had the kind of face that suggested she knew exactly what was happening and exactly how wrong it was, and she still said nothing, and she still didn't move. And when the police eventually arrived, she simply gathered her umbrella from the little stand by the door and left without a backward glance. Angela didn't blame her, not really. She understood, better than most people in that room ever could, how much easier it was to disapprove of an injustice quietly than to risk anything by naming it out loud in front of witnesses. Daniel looked around the lobby at all the raised phones and lowered eyes, and asked his mother in a voice just loud enough to carry, why nobody would say she'd done nothing wrong. Several people looked away. Nobody answered him, and nobody moved. Angela felt that silence settle into her chest harder than anything Patricia had said, because she understood, watching her son's face, that he was learning something about the world no 9-year-old should have to learn in a bank lobby on an ordinary afternoon. Marcus walked Angela and Daniel toward the glass doors, his hand resting on her shoulder rather than gripping it, as though some part of him didn't want to be doing this even as he did it. The lobby had gone quiet except for the murmur of customers still filming and the low hum of overhead lights that suddenly seemed far too loud. Angela counted her steps toward the door the way she sometimes counted her breaths during a difficult negotiation, a habit that kept her mind from racing ahead into anger. Daniel's small hand stayed locked around 2 of her fingers, and she could feel him trembling, even though he'd stopped crying somewhere in the last minute. Patricia watched them go with her arms crossed, apparently satisfied that the matter had been handled correctly, unaware that the woman walking toward the exit held more influence over her branch's future than she could possibly have imagined 10 minutes earlier. At that exact moment, the door swung open and Richard Ashford walked in, a leather folder under one arm and the unhurried posture of a man expecting a quiet late afternoon meeting. Richard was the regional CEO for the North of England division of Crown and Albion Bank, and he had come to the Fallowfield branch specifically to meet Angela after hours, away from the attention a public meeting might draw. The 2 of them were finalizing a deal worth $400 million between the bank and Reeves Logistics, a deal that had been months in the making and was scheduled to close within the week. Richard took 2 steps inside before he understood what he was looking at. Angela Reeves, the woman he'd been preparing to meet for the better part of an hour, stood with a security guard's hand on her shoulder while her son clung to her side in tears. Scraps of paper were scattered across the floor near her feet, and Richard didn't need anyone to explain what they had once been. His folder slipped out of his hand and landed against the tile. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying across the lobby with an authority that made every head turn. "Ms. Reeves." Marcus released Angela's arm immediately, stepping back as though the shoulder he'd been holding had suddenly become something he had no right to touch. Patricia moved toward Richard and began explaining quickly that she'd just prevented what she believed was a $10 million fraud attempt. Richard looked at her for a long moment before asking whether she had any idea who the woman standing in front of her actually was. Patricia opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again, clearly realizing for the first time that the question wasn't rhetorical. "I don't." She came in with a check for $10 million and no explanation. Patricia managed finally, her voice suddenly smaller than it had been for the entire preceding 15 minutes. "I was following protocol." "You were following your own assumptions," Richard said. "There's a difference, and I think you know it." Around the lobby, the customers who had spent the last several minutes recording a supposed criminal lowered their phones just enough to exchange confused glances. In front of everyone still in the branch, Richard explained that Angela Reeves was the founder of Reeves Logistics Solutions, one of the largest independent freight partners the bank currently held. He explained that Reeves Logistics was in the final stages of a $400 million agreement with Crown and Albion, and that Angela was the only person with the authority to approve or walk away from that deal. The $10 million check, he added, was entirely legitimate. The issuing solicitor had sent confirmation that same morning, a confirmation Patricia had never once bothered to check before deciding what she believed about the woman at her counter. Richard then crouched down to Daniel's eye level and apologized to him directly for what had happened inside a bank that carried the company's name on its letterhead. It was the first time since they'd walked through the doors that anyone in the building had spoken to Daniel as though his fear mattered, and he looked up at his mother as if checking whether it was safe to believe it. 2 words had been enough to reverse everything. Patricia straightened her blazer and cleared her throat, as though composure alone might undo the last few minutes. She recovered quickly, though, and rather than accepting responsibility, she insisted Angela bore some blame for the entire incident, that a woman carrying $10 million should have dressed the part, or at the very least identified herself the moment she walked through the door, as if the burden of preventing her own humiliation had rested on her rather than on the manager meant to serve her. Angela asked, without raising her voice, whether a customer needed to be wealthy before she deserved basic decency. Patricia answered by insisting she'd only been following procedure, repeating the word twice, as though saying it often enough might make it true. Richard gestured toward the torn paper still scattered on the floor and asked her to name the exact procedure that authorized a branch manager to destroy a customer's legal property in front of her child. "There is no such procedure," he said flatly. "There never has been." Patricia's face flushed, and she reached for a new excuse, this time blaming Angela for bringing her son into the bank at all, suggesting his presence had made the situation more emotional than it needed to be. That comment was the moment Angela stopped extending her any benefit of the doubt whatsoever, and something in her expression made even Richard take half a step back. Richard ordered Patricia to surrender her badge and her keys immediately, and instructed her not to touch her computer or her phone under any circumstances. Every file and note attached to her station that day would be preserved for an internal investigation, he told her in front of everyone still standing in the lobby. While attention remained fixed on Angela and Richard, Patricia quietly slipped behind her terminal and tried to delete an internal note she'd added to Angela's account only minutes earlier, describing her as a high-risk customer with suspected fraudulent intent. Priya noticed the movement out of the corner of her eye and crossed the lobby before Patricia could finish, placing a hand firmly over the keyboard. She told Patricia plainly the note needed to stay exactly where it was, then turned to Richard and informed him the branch's cameras had recorded the entire incident from multiple angles, including the moment Patricia tore the check apart in front of Daniel. Patricia's face went pale at the mention of the cameras, as though she'd forgotten entirely that the whole exchange had been filmed from the moment Angela walked through the door. Richard terminated her on the spot, right there in the lobby, in front of the same customers who had watched her tear the check apart less than 15 minutes earlier. Patricia asked to have the conversation privately in an office instead. Richard refused her outright, telling her plainly that she had humiliated Ms. Reeves in public, and she would answer for it in front of the same people who had witnessed it happen. The police arrived not long after, responding to the call Patricia had placed earlier describing a black woman attempting fraud and threatening staff. For a brief moment, Angela felt the same tightening in her chest she'd felt when the guard's hand first landed on her arm, a reflexive bracing for another round of assumptions before anyone had asked her a single question. Within 48 hours, the case would be formally closed, confirming there had been no fraud and no threat of any kind, and noting for the record that Patricia's original report had been false from the start. Several customers who had recorded the confrontation came forward as well, handing statements to the officers and, in a few cases, apologizing to Angela directly while they waited, admitting they should have said something the moment the questioning started instead of only reaching for their phones. One 10-second clip of the check being torn apart while Daniel watched ended up online before the officers had even finished taking statements inside the branch. By the time Angela and Daniel left the building that evening, the video already had thousands of views, a number that would multiply many times over before the night was through. Within hours, the clip had spread far beyond Manchester, reaching national attention almost overnight. News crews appeared outside the Fallowfield branch before the sun had fully set, and reporters stood outside the same glass doors Angela had been walked toward less than a day earlier, asking questions of anyone willing to speak on camera. Reporters discovered that Angela was a single mother who had raised her son alone for 6 years, and that the $10 million Patricia had torn apart was meant to help launch a childcare fund for parents doing exactly what Angela had spent years doing on her own. Old photographs of her dropping Daniel off at school surfaced online, alongside interviews from neighbors who described her as a quiet, private woman who had never once mentioned the size of her company to anyone in Chorlton. The contrast between what the money was actually meant to do and how its owner had been treated deepened the public outrage building around the story, with every new share, every new headline, every new panel discussion arguing over what a 9-year-old boy had just watched happen to his mother. A woman near the branch entrance the following morning was overheard asking a reporter if the whole thing had really happened the way the clip made it look, as if some part of her hoped the answer might still turn out to be no. It wasn't. Within 48 hours, the footage from every angle inside the branch had confirmed exactly what the 10-second clip had shown, and confirmed something else too, that nobody in that lobby, not one of the dozen or more people holding up a phone, had said a single word in Angela's defense until a man in a charcoal overcoat walked through the door and said her name correctly. Crown and Albion's share price began sliding as the video circulated, and the board convened an emergency session by that evening. An internal investigation launched in the following days uncovered a pattern far larger than a single afternoon at a single branch. Patricia had a documented history of freezing or denying accounts belonging to black customers and customers with lower incomes, and previous complaints against her had been quietly dismissed by branch leadership long before Angela ever walked through those doors. Commentators debated the footage for days. The phrase Patricia had used at the counter, about women like her not walking in with $10 million, was repeated across every major outlet until it became almost impossible to escape, printed under headlines, read aloud on morning television, dissected by panels of guests arguing over what it revealed about how banks treated the customers who built them. A few outlets tracked down Patricia's previous employment history, uncovering complaints from years earlier that had never made it past an internal file before that week. Investigators found at least a dozen prior reports sitting untouched in old records, each one closed without any real review, a pattern of quiet dismissal that had protected her for far longer than it should have. One former cashier who had left the branch nearly 2 years earlier came forward to say she had reported an almost identical incident involving an elderly customer whose account Patricia had frozen without explanation. That complaint, like the others, had been closed within a week with no further action, buried in a file nobody had reason to reopen until a $10 million check ended up torn on the same lobby floor. Employees who had stayed silent about her behavior for years suddenly found themselves being asked why nothing had ever been done. Some admitted they'd assumed complaints were being handled above their level. Others confessed they'd simply been afraid of losing their own jobs if they challenged a manager's decisions in front of corporate leadership. What had started as one manager's mistake was quickly becoming proof that an entire system had allowed the same behavior to continue unchecked for years. Richard spent most of that first night on the phone, fielding calls from board members who had never once asked about a single branch manager before that afternoon, all of them suddenly desperate to know how quickly the situation could be contained. More than one executive suggested quietly settling with Angela before the story grew any larger, hoping a private payout might make the entire matter disappear from the headlines within a week. Richard refused each time, telling them plainly that Angela Reeves did not strike him as a woman who could be bought into silence, and that trying would very likely make things far worse for everyone involved. Angela's phone didn't stop ringing that first night. Reporters, lawyers, and even a few distant acquaintances who'd never once called her before, but suddenly wanted to know if the rumors were true. She let almost every call go to voicemail, choosing instead to sit with Daniel and let the noise stay exactly where it belonged, on the other side of a door she had no plans to open that evening. But the sharpest blow of all didn't come from the board, the lawyers, or the reporters calling for comment. It came from Daniel later that night, sitting across from her at their kitchen table, picking at a dinner neither of them had much appetite for. He looked up and asked whether anyone would have apologized at all if they hadn't found out she was rich. Angela set down her fork and looked at her son for a long moment, searching for an answer that wouldn't feel like a lie. She had none. She'd been cleared because she happened to hold power that most people never would. And she understood, sitting there with his question hanging in the air between them, that thousands of other people walked into banks just like that one every single day without a regional CEO arriving in time to call them ma'am. She thought about all the videos and headlines already circulating her name, all the strangers online arguing about what had happened to her, and realized that almost none of them were asking the question Daniel had just asked at their own kitchen table. Everyone wanted to talk about the check. Almost nobody wanted to talk about what happened to the people who didn't happen to be carrying one worth $10 million, or the ones who never got a chance to have their names cleared on the evening news by anybody at all. Outside, she could still hear the faint sound of a car slowing near the house, one of several that had crept past since the story broke, drivers craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the woman everyone online was suddenly talking about. Angela pulled the curtain shut and turned her attention back to her son, the only audience that had ever mattered to her in the first place. For the first time since the check had been torn in half, her own vindication felt entirely hollow to her, and she sat with that feeling long after Daniel had gone quiet, staring at the last uneaten pieces of food on his plate. She reached over and squeezed his hand, unable to give him the honest answer he deserved, and unable to stop thinking about what she might do instead. The lawyers arrived at her house 3 days later with an offer already prepared, a financial settlement, a public apology, the termination of several employees, all in exchange for one simple condition. Angela would sign the $400 million agreement as planned and say nothing further about what had happened inside the Fallowfield branch. She listened to the entire proposal without interrupting, aware that a single signature from her could still cost Crown and Albion hundreds of millions of dollars and end more than one career at the top of the company. Part of her wanted to walk away entirely, to take Daniel somewhere far from cameras and reporters and never set foot inside another branch again. But she thought about his question from that first night, and she understood that punishing Patricia and pressuring the bank into a public statement would satisfy her own anger. But it would do nothing for the next person who walked into a bank without a CEO waiting nearby to vouch for them. She also thought about the customers who had stood in that lobby with their phones raised, recording everything and saying nothing, and about how easily an entire room had agreed through silence to let an injustice happen in plain sight. Punishing one manager wouldn't change that kind of silence. Only something built to outlast the headlines might have a real chance of doing that. She thought, too, about Marcus's quiet admission that he'd known something felt wrong and hadn't trusted himself enough to act on it, and about how many other employees across the country probably carried that same doubt without ever being given permission to speak it out loud. If the bank walked away from this having only fired one manager, nothing underneath her would have actually changed. The challenge in front of Angela was no longer proving that a $10 million check was real. It was proving that power, once handed to someone who had felt its absence, could be used to protect the people who never got the chance to hold any of it themselves. She refused the personal settlement outright, telling the lawyers she had no interest in being paid to stay quiet. One of them, a younger solicitor who kept glancing nervously at the folder in front of him, asked if she understood what she was walking away from, a figure with 6 commas attached to it, gone, in exchange for conditions that wouldn't put a single extra pound in her own account. Angela told him she understood exactly what she was walking away from, and that it was precisely the point. Instead, she laid out a list of conditions that had nothing to do with her own bank account and everything to do with what happened the next time someone without her last name walked through those doors. Every branch would undergo an independent audit for discriminatory conduct, carried out by outside investigators rather than the bank's own compliance office, which had already proven it couldn't be trusted to mark its own homework. Any decision to freeze or deny a customer's account would require sign-off from a second manager before it could take effect. Customers would have the explicit right to request independent verification during any dispute, rather than being left entirely at the mercy of a single employee's judgment. Employees who reported wrongdoing would be protected from retaliation, a condition she insisted on directly because of what she'd watched happen to Priya in the middle of that lobby, threatened with the loss of her own job for offering to make one phone call. Frontline staff, including security personnel, would receive proper training on when and how to question an order that was clearly wrong, instead of following it simply because it came from someone standing above them on an organizational chart. Security footage and transaction records could no longer be deleted once a complaint had been filed against an employee. Customer rights would be posted publicly inside every branch, in plain language anyone could read while standing in a queue. The bank would be required to publicly disclose how it had handled every ignored complaint from the past, including the ones already buried in old files long before Angela ever walked through the doors of the Fallowfield branch. And finally, Crown and Albion would fund a permanent child care assistance program for single-parent families across the Northwest, seeded with the same money that had once been torn apart on a lobby floor. The board resisted at first, arguing that some of the conditions went far beyond what any single incident required. Richard sat through most of those negotiations himself, reminding them more than once that the cost of refusing Angela's terms would almost certainly exceed the cost of accepting them, and that a company willing to fight this hard to avoid changing its own culture was, in his words, telling on itself. With the deal and the company's reputation both hanging in the balance, the board had little room left to argue. Within the week, every condition had been accepted and written into the final agreement, alongside a public timeline for when each change would take effect across every branch in the region. Patricia's banking license was permanently revoked, and she now faced a civil claim alongside a formal charge for filing a false police report. Employees who had helped quietly bury previous complaints against her were placed under a formal review of their own, closing out a pattern of silence that had protected her for years longer than it should have. Lawyers representing several of her past customers began reaching out within days, asking whether they too had grounds to come forward now that her history was finally being examined in daylight. Marcus, the security guard, was reinstated once the investigation confirmed what the footage had already shown, that he had never used force against Angela and had let go of her arm the instant Richard spoke. He was placed into the very training program Angela had insisted on, learning alongside other staff how to recognize and refuse an order that crossed a clear line. When he saw her again weeks later, he apologized quietly, admitting he wished he'd trusted his own instincts sooner instead of waiting for someone else to give him permission to do the right thing. "I knew something felt wrong," he told her. I just didn't trust that feeling enough to say so out loud. Angela told him there was nothing left to apologize for, that she remembered clearly how his hand had never once tightened on her arm, and that she wanted him to know it hadn't gone unnoticed. Priya was kept on and promoted to assistant branch manager, a new role that put her in charge of rolling out the staff training program across the entire region, all because she'd been the only person in that lobby willing to speak up while everyone else stayed silent. Angela made a point of thanking her personally before she left the branch that day, telling her that her willingness to say something out loud had mattered more than she probably realized in the moment it counted. The bank issued a replacement check once the original had been formally voided, and Angela split the money exactly as she'd always planned. Half went into the trust, securing Daniel's future. The other half became the seed money for the Reeves Family Fund, a program built to help single parents across Greater Manchester access the childcare they needed to take the jobs they were already qualified for. Angela insisted the very first round of grants be administered out of the Fallowfield branch itself, the same building that had once refused to believe she belonged there. A place that had turned her and her son away would now be the place responsible for handing opportunity to families who looked a great deal like her own. 3 months later, Angela and Daniel walked back through those same glass doors. She still drove the same Corsa and wore the same jacket, unwilling to change anything about herself simply because the world had briefly decided her appearance mattered more than it should have. Daniel held her hand the same way he had that first afternoon, though there was nothing tense in his grip this time, only the easy comfort of a boy walking beside his mother on an ordinary errand. The bank, however, looked different in ways that went beyond fresh paint or new signage. An employee greeted them the moment they stepped inside, asking how she could help before either of them had said a word. Nobody's eyes lingered on Angela's jacket or her car keys before deciding how she should be treated. A new placard near the entrance listed every customer's rights in plain language, alongside a number for an independent complaint line that had nothing to do with the branch itself. Priya came over to greet them in her new role, mentioning that the first round of staff training had already rolled out across the entire region, and that early feedback from other branches had been better than anyone expected. Marcus stood near the door in his uniform, and when he caught sight of Angela, he offered a small, genuine nod, a far cry from the tense hesitation she remembered from 3 months earlier. None of the customers who had once stood filming with their phones raised ever came back to that branch again, and Angela noticed their absence without needing to say anything about it, understanding that some kinds of silence simply choose to stay hidden rather than be confronted. A small plaque near the wall bore the name of the new fund. Daniel watched a young father at the counter opening his daughter's first savings account, met with none of the suspicion they'd faced that same afternoon 3 months earlier. Nobody questioned whether he belonged there. Daniel watched the scene for a long moment before turning to his mother and asked if that was the reason she hadn't simply walked away from the bank forever. Angela thought about it before answering, choosing her words carefully because she wanted him to actually understand them, not just hear them. Closing a door is easy, she told him. Making it open for everyone is harder. Daniel nodded slowly, the way he did when he was turning an idea over in his mind rather than simply accepting it. He looked back at the young father at the counter, then up at his mother again, as if measuring the distance between the fear he remembered from 3 months earlier and the calm he was watching unfold in front of him now. Before they left, Angela let Daniel hand the very first grant letter from the new fund to a young mother being helped by one of Priya's trainees. The woman's hands shook slightly as she read it, and she looked up at Angela with an expression that needed no translation. The particular relief of someone who has spent years being told no by people who never once looked closely enough to understand her situation. Watching his mother's face and the young woman side by side, Daniel understood he was finally learning the thing that mattered, that $10 million had never been what made her matter in that lobby, or any lobby. What mattered was that she'd had the power to seek revenge, and had chosen instead to make sure the next person through those doors would be treated like they belonged there from the start. Father and son, no, mother and son, Angela corrected herself with a small private smile, still catching herself slipping into old habits of thought, walked out together, finally continuing the plans that had been interrupted 3 months earlier. A stop at the bookshop on Deangate, then chips at the cafe by the tram stop, exactly as they'd promised each other that first ordinary Tuesday morning that had turned into anything but ordinary. Angela did not win the day Richard Ashford recognized her as a powerful founder standing in her own branch. The real victory only arrived once she used that same power to make sure the next person walking through those doors would be treated fairly, no matter who they were, what they wore, or how much money they happened to be carrying that day. If you had been standing in that lobby the day it began, would you have stayed silent behind a raised phone, or would you have been the first to stand up for a mother and her son? A person should never need $10 million to be treated with basic respect. If this story moved you, subscribe for more and carry that same lesson with you the next time you're standing in a room where someone else is being underestimated.